So I want to welcome everyone tonight to the another WFFA online educational event. And in this one, we've decided to do something a little bit different. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Elaine O'Neill. I'm the Executive Director of Washington Farm Forestry Association. Before we get going today, I wanted to talk a little bit about an effort that was initiated actually about 15 months ago. 15 months ago, Washington Tree Farm Program and Washington Farm Forestry Association got together and started talking about what do we do about carbon? What happens if something comes up in the legislature? How can we position ourselves to be ready to respond as a small forest landowner community? So we worked on bits and pieces. We brought in some folks, we talked about it, and we came away with a few key points. And then the legislative session happened last year, and there was just a lot of action. And what came out of it near the end of that session was something called the Climate Commitment Act. It's a massive bill that looks at all sorts of different ways that the state can improve its climate footprint. A portion of that bill is a carbon work group for small forest landowners. And that the language for that carbon work group for small forest landowners was the language that we worked on. We literally had a couple of hours, I'm going to say 4 hours, to turn around language. So John Henriksen and I got together and said, okay, we drafted this stuff up. How do we use this? Because this was the opportunity that was presented. So that language got into statute. It was passed. So there is in statute, as part of the Climate Commitment Act, implement a small forest landowner carbon work group to understand what would work for small forest landowners. It's supposed to be a contract from DNR. Unfortunately, you didn't get funded, or we would have been started this already. And we would be a lot further along than we are now. Now, this legislative session, DNR has introduced a new piece of proposed legislation called Keep Washington Evergreen. And it's really focused on what do you do around development? What do you do around reforesting areas that say have burned over or that are understocked or whatever? So there's 2 or 3 key elements of that. And but the key point is the focus is on incentives to help small forest landowners do this. And one of the incentives is carbon. So if you've ever done any of these work group kind of work, you can do all this work and you get this nice product and you give it to the legislature and nothing happens. It's like it goes on a shelf. Who cares? What a waste of effort. This is actually an opportunity with this Keep Washington Evergreen to take the results from the work group and actually use it to develop a plan or to develop an outcome. That particular legislation is being heard this week. It was heard yesterday in the House. It'll be heard tomorrow in the Senate at 1:30, Senate Ag and Natural Resources Committee. It ran into a little bit of a snag yesterday. There were a bunch of folks that signed in, said, no, we don't like this because we don't like the way DNR harvests. And it was like, well, this doesn't have anything to do with DNR. This has everything to do with smalls. So I wanted to alert people to that. We do have some people that are testifying in favor of it because, again, we helped get language in that bill that would support small forest landowners keeping forests as forests. So we do have, I'm going to be testifying. Actually, John is going to be testifying. Ken Miller is going to be testifying. Tom Westergreen is going to be testifying. But if you feel so inclined, or if you need more information, then I would suggest if you want to provide a written comment. I mean, if you really want to sit there for 2 hours and testify, all the more power to you. Or if you want to sign in that would help the process. And I will, there's already a question, how do I do that? I will put all the information in the chat so people can harvest that over the course of this. And then I'll also put my email in there if people want to just email me and we can follow it up from there. So that's the sort of carbon, where are we right now? That's, I'm going to say at the strategic level, at the state level, at the policy level, that's different than what we wanted to do today. We had lots of conversations, and bless Ann Stinson, who's our newest author. Do you have a book to put up there, Ann? Our newest author, Small Forest Landowner Forever. She started asking the questions, well, what about carbon? I want to ask questions about carbon. And we decided that the best way to do this would be for Ann to ask the questions that you probably all have, and there's other questions, to somebody in our cohort who doesn't have all the answers, but he's certainly explored a lot of things, and that's John Henriksen. So John is also a longtime tree farmer here out of sort of South Sound, Oakville area, and Ann is down on the Cowlitz River. And so they're going to do this Q&A. We haven't really figured out all the questions, so this will be nice and organic, but a Q&A that will build off of what John talks about. And then just before we go, Ann, I want you to do just, I'm going to do a little plug for your book, and then you can say whatever you want. Ann just published her tree farming memoir. I think that's what I'm going to call it. It's really an awesome little book. I was at the opening on just before Christmas, bought quite a few Christmas presents, read it. I actually read it in one night, and I just stayed up. I just read it. It's a wonderful story, and it's something that Ann thought would be her contribution. So Ann, I wanted you to show up and just bring it really close to the screen. And if you want to say a couple of words, you're muted.
The ground at my feet, sustaining a family and a forest. And yes, I tried to put a bunch of things about carbon in. Actually, at the end, I had to go back out and take them out because I'd put too many things in. That sounded a little preachy. But anyway, thank you for saying that you loved it. And I'm hoping that everyone will love it. So thank you.
So that's my little promo. And with this, I think I'm ready to let John and Ann just have this conversation. And I think if we put our questions in the chat, either Paula or I can track that.
As I can say, I can look through the chat too. And
perfect. I'm going to let you do it.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
All right.
So the first question I had for John was what's new? We've been talking about carbon for a long time, and all of us are kind of wanting to know when we can get on board, what we can do. But so he's going to start by talking about what Washington State is thinking of doing with carbon.
Right. Okay. I'm just going to switch to share a screen here. So yeah, this is what's happening today with carbon. And I'll tell you before I jump into it, a lot has changed in just the last year. It went over a threshold where it is completely accessible at some level to small tree farmers. And I'll get into that in detail. But first, I want to talk about what Washington State is thinking of in terms of carbon and where their focus is. This was a study done by the Nature Conservancy that looked at any possible ways of natural carbon sequestration in the state. And you'll notice that the meat of it is they're utterly focused on extended timber harvest rotation, because that is where the big potential for natural carbon sequestration is in this study. And I don't have any of the details behind this study, but I kind of figured that's where they were going to go anyways, but this just puts some numbers on that. So it's about 70% or so of what's possible in the whole scheme of things, all the things you could do listed there. And then Ann, of course, you interrupt me.
Yeah, no, I'm just wondering, do you know why they have avoided conversion of forest as not much? I mean, do you know? I mean, that seems like that would be a big one too.
Right. I think they probably looked at not all the potential conversion of forest, but the likely what would happen over time, probably looking at historical trends and extrapolating that out.
Okay.
So, and then there's, other things you can do, but they're fractional compared to what they're looking at there. So that's what they're going to target there. And this kind of gives you an example of why. This is a comparison of carbon either sequestered, lost, or retained in product from a short 40-year rotation compared to an 80-year-old rotation. And I won't spend a whole lot of time on this other than to point out that the green area is the accumulated standing carbon in the forest, and the blue area is the carbon in product that had some degradation over time, but jumps up. Every one of those peaks there is either a restoration harvest or a thinning. So the big jumps, of course, are when you do a replacement harvest there. So this is where that big green area there on the left is where you get the big carbon hit, sequestration hit, by going to extended rotation. And
wait, we had a question from the back, the other slide. What does conversion of forest mean? So the third one, avoided conversion of forest.
So I think what they mean there is that if maybe perhaps what's being embodied in this current bill that they're talking about is steps taken to avoid conversion would produce a certain retention of
conversion
carbon
to development or
compared to existing trends.
Right.
So
right.
if you made less conversion happen because of some policy or incentive,
right.
This is what they figured you could get out of it.
Okay.
Based on a ambitious, moderate, or limited
right.
effort.
Great.
Okay, so this is this slide just points out why we don't do extended rotations now anyways, is as everybody's familiar with, once you hit that inflection point at 40 to 50 years, your return drops below a reasonable rate of return, and you start losing money compared to other investment options. So that's the primary driver. And this shows different site classes, how that curve happens there. And then this slide is kind of the inverse of that, which shows that your growth rate, as we know, really accelerates in the first 40, 50 years, and then it flattens out. And that's corresponds to your rate of return going down, because your rate of growth flattens out, but your volume of growth stays fairly stable. In this case, where they analyzed an old growth forest, it went on for hundreds of years. So what the graph represents is the basal area increment year by year. And that's basically a proxy for carbon sequestration, how much wood volume.
And what's the difference between the top line and the bottom line?
Okay, so the top line represents a subset of large diameter trees in an old growth stand, and in that same stand, the lower line represents the smaller diameter trees.
So suppressed trees.
Well, not exactly suppressed. I would say they're maybe a little bit less than codominant. The study here probably gets into great detail about that distinction there, but I like this distinction because if you were a tree farmer designing a long-term rotation or aiming for old growth habitat, if you wanted really big trees, you would thin aggressively to get that higher, bigger tree volume. However, if you were trying to extend your rotation to get smaller diameter trees and more of them, you would pick the bottom curve there.
Okay.
And because you're getting probably the same amount of volume growth in the stand, it's just distributed among fewer trees, and you end up with smaller diameter bolls, which makes it
Easier
more
to harvest, yeah.
attractive
More
for
market.
harvesting in a higher
Right.
quality wood, because you know
Right.
you're not going to, it's not going to be branchy.
Right,
The upper curve is going to be pretty branchy, I'll bet.
got it. Okay,
So that's kind of the groundwork for what extended rotations involve. And that's not the only way that you sequester carbon. This is just the one that the state is going to be focusing on. And so we want to get really familiar with the parameters of that. And based on this, I had done an analysis of the pros and cons of extended rotation. I'm not going to get into the details of this, just to point out silviculturally what the benefits of doing it, or the cons. Harvest and milling logistics, profitability, that's your biggest con with doing your long rotation. And then the one that everyone's focused on here, environment and carbon, what are the pluses and minuses of going from a short rotation to a long rotation. And I just picked up another one today, a con for longer rotations that I'm on the Northern Spotted Owl implementation team, and they informed me that you get a 60, 80 years, you are going to start attracting, you could attract owls for foraging, not necessarily nesting. And maybe many of you already knew that, but I thought they needed it quite older than that, but apparently they're saying that.
so just for the return on investment then, so one possibility is that if we get paid for carbon, then that would be a subsidy that you said subsidy required to make whole. So I mean, is
Right.
that one
That's
idea?
that's
Okay.
precisely what it is, and that's why I'm kind of setting the stage for
Right,
the following slides. Is that is the number one barrier, and if that can be addressed, most of these other issues can be resolved. And I think a lot of tree farmers would, I don't know about industry, but a lot of tree farmers would be interested in this if they could be made whole financially or close to it.
right.
So that's setting the stage here. Now I'll get into 3 different programs that are out there now, and talk about the one that I actually enrolled in. This is Finite Carbon. It's a, I'm kind of stealing their slides from a presentation they gave. This is one of the new programs that's super easy to get enrolled in because you do it online. It takes less than half an hour to actually submit your data and get some information. I did not actually do this one, so I'm just going to tell you the highlights of that. They set the stage by talking about the history of carbon programs, and from top to bottom shows you the evolution to where we are today. The old compliance markets at the top are the first ones that came out, and they're really expensive to implement. They're highly restricted with generally with a 100-year easement or a perpetual easement. It does tend to pay fairly well, but there's no way that any small landowner can participate. The costs are, you're talking 10,000 acres or more. And then there's the voluntary version of that, but still you're talking 5,000 acres or more and 40-year contracts compared to the 100 years. Up until a few years ago, those were really the only ones available. Since then, you have another version here that where you aggregate landowners into a program so that you can get a little economy of scale, but those are pretty complicated and customized and take a lot of work. So some folks have gone that route, but that won't work for most of our tree farmers because the bottom option has come around and has become very attractive in terms of the simplicity of the program. So that's what we're going to talk about, the small landowner programs that are available. And all the small landowner programs that I'm going to talk about involve the voluntary market. And that means that these are markets for companies that want to do good and just get some PR for helping sequester carbon. They're not required to do this, but they want to show that they're doing something, whereas the regulatory market is like what you have in California, where the government mandates that you have to reduce your carbon as a business. And one of the ways to do that is you can buy carbon credits from willing vendors like a landowner. So
all three of these top ones don't really matter to us because they're too many acres needed.
it's too many acres, it's too expensive.
Okay.
It won't scale up. So that's why that never happened
So, all right.
for us.
Mhm.
So this core program gets us down to, like they say, 40 to 5,000 acres. It's now gone below that threshold into our realm. And they are very technologically based in the sense they use remote sensing to assess your land. You go online and you identify your parcel. And in this case, you're identifying parts of your parcel, and you draw a little graphic around that and submit that to them. And they have their algorithm. Here's the process. You find your property online, you create your project, and you tell them what you want to do. And generally in these, you talk about harvest plans, because they do allow harvest, but that's going to impact how much you get credit for. You get an instant quote and you submit it, and then it's a matter of following through on it. So this one here has two cycles: a first 20-year cycle, and then another 20-year cycle after that, where you get, primarily from deferring harvest, you get payments. And at year 20, there's an opportunity to double down or hold on to what you've got, or you can get out of the program there. So that's a 20-year.
I have a question about that one. So
Go
does
ahead.
stop generating credits mean that you cut down your trees? And I mean, and then if it does mean that, can you start over again with reprod? I mean, with a newly planted stand?
Yeah, so this one is maintaining stock and harvesting the growth instead of receiving payment. So the payments continue if you're creating new growth, is my assumption here.
Oh, even ages 1 through 5, that's still new growth?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if that actually is measures up. I don't think you're going to be able to measure that from the point of view of carbon significantly, but the idea is that if you maintain the level you've built up, but don't and cut away your new growth, you're not going to get any more money out of this program. So don't ask too many questions about this particular program, because I did not get into it other than hearing their presentation.
Okay, I think Elaine has her hand up.
Okay.
So Anne has asked me to manage the chat, and we have a few questions. They occur from a little bit before.
Sure.
And so we're going to go back to that. We answered the conversion of forest. And then there was a note here from Steve that there was a Smithsonian article he saw that suggests that volume of trees grows when they're above 150 years old or so, which contradicts your graph.
You mean the volume increases on an annual basis?
Yeah, I would like to have a look at that data myself.
Yeah, I would love to see that, because I want to get it right. So
well, I'm not certain I believe the Smithsonian article, but I would have to look at the data.
I think they might be confusing rate of growth with amount of growth or something like that. But that's the study I have the document, and I can provide it. I've got a PDF document of where that graph came from, and it's pretty extensive.
And then the next one, which I think you're probably going to address through time, is are there different prices for all these programs?
Right, that's an excellent question. I'm glad you brought that up. We're going to get into that very quickly. Very soon, I'm going to start talking about that. But there's a step change in prices from the regulated markets to the voluntary markets, and the small landowner ones are going to be on the low end of that price range. They're a lot better than I thought they would be, but they're still not really great. And that's because they're small scale, and some of their methodologies and verification are still innovative, and not everybody is really happy with how they do it, but that's only going to get better over time, the remote sensing and the methodology. So we'll see how that price changes, and we'll get into that in the next few slides.
And so then there was another question on your, your pros and cons. And it was, why would increasing harvest on public timber so that private timber stands can go to longer harvests? Isn't that just changing where the carbon's held? How does that increase overall storage of carbon?
Yeah,
so that's what do they call it? A leakage question.
Yeah, no, and I had notes to support some of those points that I didn't include in this slideshow. That is a conundrum, but the way that works is that you can't extend rotations unilaterally without crashing the timber industry and the markets and the supply chain infrastructure, whatever.
The mills. Yeah, right.
So how do you get around that problem? Well, the amount that you defer on industrial or productive land has to be offset by production from non-commercial lands, i.e. state and federal.
Were there more groceries on?
And so how do you do that? Well, the land that isn't in production, that's kind of in reserve or whatever, I'm sure there's a lot of that can be thinned or restored or whatever to, you kind of have to make that trade-off, that we're going to go into the state and federal forests in areas that we haven't harvested, and for the good of all, we're going to actually improve those stands to make them long-term better sequesters of carbon by doing the thinning that really needs to happen now. So I haven't quantified that, but that's really the only place you can temporarily trade to keep the volume steady going to the mills. But it gets easier every year you go, because as you, after 20 or 40 years, not only can you stop harvesting or thinning the public lands, but you'll have vastly more volume on private lands that you can work with.
It almost seems like the supply chain needs to be subsidized monetarily for 40 years while we wait for trees to grow or something.
Something like that, but I would hope that it could be subsidized by substituting
from them. Yes, no,
the supply from forests that really need to be thinned anyways.
Right.
All right.
Then there was another question about how much money are we talking about here for the private landowners. So that's getting back to your price, and you'll cover that.
We're going right there.
Okay, so I'm going to let you go there. People are excited. They're asking questions ahead of time.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, here we go. So I'm not going to spend any more time on this one here, but all these programs generally require you to be monitored and report. This one commits a harvest deferral of 20 to 40 years. So that kind of soured me on this one. It's like, I don't want to commit to that. I mean, it's 100 years, forget it. 20 to 40 years, not. Let's see what else we got. So they throw in some things that you can kind of do for targeted for small landowners of personal use stuff, and transferability, and you don't have to be certified, blah, blah, blah. So that's nice to know. They're trying to tailor this for small landowners and be sensitive to their needs going forward. So that's that one. The next one is the Family Forest Carbon Program put out by American Forest Foundation, the parent organization to the Tree Farm Program, American Tree Farm System. It's a partnership with the Nature Conservancy and big money funded by like Amazon. I'm not sure who their corporate investors are. It's a very novel approach. Right off the bat, I'll tell you, it's not available in Washington State right now. They're really going nuts trying to get this off the ground in the East, but they would like to take this nationwide. And you can see from this slide that they have really ambitious goals. 20% of family-owned forests nationally by 2030. That would be phenomenal if they can do that.
Why are they focusing on the East Coast first? We have all the trees.
Yeah.
No, do you know?
I think it's nearby, but also understand that where they're working in the East Coast is all generally shade tolerant hardwoods, so they don't have a clear-cut regime like we do. So those forests just naturally regenerate, and so you always have standing stock. So it's a better fit initially.
Interesting. Okay.
And so this is a program that is more like a CREP program, a Conservation Reserve Program, where you do activities. You agree to do certain management options on your land. And the goal of this one is to increase your carbon and increase the quality of your stand and all the co-benefits that go with it, as they show in the bottom line there. They're shorter term contracts. Now we're getting down to 10 to 20 years. Annual payments begin in year 1. And that's a little weird because if you're doing improved forest management, there's really no increase in year 1. So how are you getting paid for it? And I'll explain to that at the end of this section here. Again, it's a practice-based approach. So it's not about measuring your carbon and seeing how much that changes. It says, these are the practices we want you to take, and they're pretty much guaranteed to increase your carbon. So eligibility, 30 to 2,400 acres, getting right down into our group. Unfortunately, not currently located in a service area. This is all East Coast, but now they're expanding to the Midwest, Northeast, and Southeast this year. This is last year's presentation. Again, they look to, and we'll talk about this in the next program there, that how do they talk about a baseline to measure your improvement against. And so they use a region-specific criterion. They look at the lands around you to see how you are going to be doing different. And that's how they measure an increase. So this is how the money happens there. They front you the money because they get a bond, an environmental bond, and that's where the corporate sponsors put it up, and it's kind of a prepayment. And after 10 years or so, you have something you can count and verify, and then you can sell that to a carbon buyer, and then the money you get from selling the carbon buyer, you pay back the bond. So there's a little pay me now, and then I'll pay for it later. I'm not going to get into a lot of detail on that, but that's how they're able to pay you up front for something you haven't created yet. Because this is a program that is not measuring your existing carbon. It's saying, do these practices. It has a reasonable expectation to create carbon sequestration. We'll measure it in 10 years. We'll take care of the accounting, but we've decided what that would be worth, and we'll pay you up front. So it's a pretty innovative model. but we don't have it here yet. How it works, you get a hold of them. And so this is more of a hands-on, takes a little bit more time process. It's not go on the internet, spend 10 minutes and get a quote. So, but it's probably pretty streamlined, pretty friendly process there. And we'll see how that goes. I won't get into the details of this, but it does try to make a good distinction between traditional carbon projects and their program and how much more accessible theirs is. Here's an example they use. This is probably the Midwest. There's your eligibility. It must be natural regeneration. Plantation's not eligible. Now, this is interesting for the concept of the West, but I think Doug fir and any of the species that we grow does qualify for that. I'm not absolutely sure, but I'm reasonably sure when they think plantations, they're talking about exotics. No legal encumbrances, excluding timber harvest. Oh, this is also just an example there. There's your stocking, oops, 2,000 board feet per acre. And then here we go, starting to get to money. And this, you got to be careful here because this is a little bit of a trick. Annual payments based on board feet per acre. Payments range from $100 to $203 an acre, but that's kind of not being honest because that's for the period of 10 to 20 acres. I mean, 10 to 20 years. So it's $100 to $230 an acre for 10 to 20 years. So you're really looking at more in the realm of $10 per acre per year is what they're doing there.
Wait, so $100 spread over the 20 years?
That's probably spread over 10 years.
Oh.
And the 230 is spread over 20 years, something like that.
Huh. Okay, well.
And this is an example, of course, in the Midwest, so ours could be higher, but that's the first introduction of a price point. So let's start at $10 per acre per year. And I'd be curious to hear from others. I always had this figure in my head that if you're growing timber and prime ground out here, you'd want to be in the $300 per acre per year realm over time. And so I'll just throw that out there and see if folks that know a lot better than me can just throw a price point out for growing timber, period. Okay, and then we'll move on to the last one here. It's natural capital exchange, formerly known as Sylvia Terra. And this is the one that I followed through on. This is the one that I felt was the best fit. It's very high tech. They've mapped the entire United States and satellite imagery. They incorporate Forest Service FIA data, and I guess they do some ground measurements too. So they literally take your stand, you pick it on a map, on a online map, and they analyze it, run it through their algorithm and figure volume by species of all things. And a few years ago, we talked about, wouldn't it be great when that happens, that in terms of cruising, you can just do it from a satellite? Like, what kind of accuracy are you getting? Well, they're getting a lot better now. I don't know what the figure is, but what we dreamed about a few years ago is there. And that's the game changer that allowed them to do these kind of programs. Because the biggest hurdle of the old programs is the measurement. The manual measurement of large properties is hugely costly. And this gets around that. Literally, you get an answer instantaneously. So these guys take it to a whole new level here. It's a 1-year commitment. I mean, how is that even possible to quantify and make that measurable. No fees for enrollment, no minimum acreage. Like, wow, they took it right to the floor here. And then look on down here is another price point that's very similar to the one we just saw, $5 to $15 per acre per year. And this is, yeah, per acre per year, average. And the reason there's such a wide spread there is that the landowner actually bids for a price, and there's a reverse auction that goes on. And I didn't go through that step because I couldn't quite wrap my head around it. I may do it on the next round.
What's a reverse auction?
Okay, well, a reverse auction is where you say, I'll sell X amount of my credits at a high price, a small amount at a high price, but if that nobody takes that, I'll accept another lower price for more credits or whatever. So it's an auction that brings the price down rather than up.
Right, but who's actually doing the buying?
Well, there are corporate entities
Oh,
that are brokered through this organization. This organization presents
got it.
the lands and the landowners bids,
Mm-hmm.
and the corporations go through and say, I'll take so much at this price and whatever.
It's a crazy world out there.
It is. It's nuts.
Elaine, you have your hand up. Or is that still from last time?
No, that's not still from last time. I have so many questions about these programs.
Sure.
You just wouldn't even believe it. Okay. How do they know that you're have no intention of not harvesting this year, and this is just a way to make money for the next decade?
Okay.
I mean, this looks like it's open for abuse.
They have addressed that. I'll get into that. Hang on, and if I don't adequately address it, just
okay, then I want to back up a couple slides because
okay. To where?
There, right there. So when I look at this slide and I think about minimum stocking, annual payments based on board feet per acre, must be natural regeneration, et cetera, it sounds to me like this is really tailored to something other than what we are. And so for us here in the West, I mean, I used an example the other day. I have a naturally regenerated stand because the last time they logged it, they didn't bother reforesting it.
Right.
I mean, it's well, and it's not even good alder. It's just sort of scattered all over the place. And I know what volume I got off of it, and I know what I should have got off of it. So this idea that if it's natural, it's better, you know, that just wouldn't work here. So is there opportunity to take this model and say, hey, we don't like the way you're doing it out here in the West, when you want to put on board feet, like 500 board feet per acre per year is kind of an average?
I think the slide right before it said that it would be tailored to individual forest types.
Yeah,
so this is just an example for this kind of forest.
Okay.
Yeah, so they would have to adapt it to the way we grow here.
Yeah.
I wouldn't be concerned about that, but also as I'm looking at all of these examples, Elaine, I'm thinking of how we can take their best ideas and create our own if it comes to that, because I think they're carving a lot of ground that is very useful, and I'd almost like to pick and choose among them to get just the right one that's not there yet.
So that's what we need to do in the carbon work group.
Exactly.
Norwood has a good comment here. Wouldn't we be better off harvesting our timber at market highs and investing the money in green tech like solar and wind? These numbers wouldn't even come close to covering property taxes.
Exactly. You hit the nail on the head. That's going to be your biggest barrier. So continuing to harvest on a normal cycle, you just can't beat that. Sorry.
Yeah. So
go ahead.
advance a couple of slides. I had another question on that one up, the NCX one. Go back one to that blue thing. Okay, so I know a little bit about this program, and I know a little bit about the critics of this program. It's apparently a black box, so nobody really knows how it works.
Yes.
And we do have interests in this state, including people within DNR, whom shall remain nameless, that want to do something similar, but make it so it's transparent, because these guys, you're using proprietary something or other. So you don't really know whether, you don't know how they're doing it. And so there's a lot of suspicion out there amongst the people that do this kind of remote sensing work as to the accuracy of that. And I just wanted people to hear that. And I think the red flag for me is that they're using Forest Service FIA data. And unless you get special dispensation, you do not get the real points. So if you're using fuzzed FIA data, the whole algorithm is wacko. So I don't know if they have that agreement or not to use FIA data, but anyway.
Yeah, and I'm going to get into some of the methodology here to kind of flesh this out. At least the parts they're willing to share.
Hey, John,
Okay.
can you hear me?
Yeah.
Dick, bless you. I grew up in the Midwest and spent a fair amount of time in the East. I didn't see a lot of tree nurseries back there. Did not.
Well, they don't replant in the East, except in the Southeast, where I grew up in the Northeast. Nobody replants.
They don't plant. They don't harvest like we do, except maybe Upper Michigan, and they're doing pulp logs. Yeah,
the northern pine forest is a different story.
Okay, that's all.
Okay, all right. So I'll move on to the next one here. We saw that slide. It gives you the basic eligibility, or not eligibility, but what's involved. So this gives you a little insight into their methodology. They start with the inventory from the base map, and that includes crunching with the FIA data for comparison. And then they look at the ownership type and harvest behavior. So I don't know how they figure this out, that they actually want to see that you are harvesting, or that harvesting is a thing around you, because by deferring harvest, you are creating additionality. So, and that ties into number 3, access to markets, which is, we have one of the best where we are here, of course. I think that actually, I'm not sure if that improves your position. I think maybe it does, because there's a high access to market means high probability of harvest, high probability that if you don't take a step to defer harvest, it will be harvested. And then, of course, market conditions there. So they throw these things into the algorithm to decide how many credits you get. And forgive me if I don't fully understand this myself, to be able to answer some questions that you're obviously going to have on this. And here we go, how this happens here. I won't get into the details, but you've got your measurement and enrollment process. And then you go into the marketplace, you bid out your credits to see what happens. And then every year they monitor and audit what's happened. So they'll see this, the eye in the sky will tell if you've maintained your 1-year commitment. And of course, you could go year after year after year, this iterative process. And I like that. And another point about having an annual, a year-by-year contract is that carbon markets are wildly going up and down. And the way things are going now, they're going to go up a lot. That means there's no good
You
reason
don't
to
want to get locked in.
do not want to get locked in at a low price. And they really push this angle here. It's like, hey, we're going to stay with the market. It's a 1-year deal. And I like that part about that. I think that's really smart of them. So the process is you go online, and it's really neat. You don't have to draw your boundary lines because it already has the tax parcels. So you click on them. And this program has a requirement that you have to enroll all of your land. That's one of their requirements to avoid being accused of leakage, at least among your own holdings. So you got to do the whole thing or nothing at all. So you submit that, and they you answer some questions. I did this online, took me 10 minutes. I submitted it, and in a few days I got a response. That's just from their website. And you can go to this website. I encourage you, ncx.com. I'm not even going to write it down. It's that easy. And just tool around in there. They got a big FAQ, frequently asked questions. And it really, and I've got it queued up on my screen if you ask me those questions, but just go there. They really get into some amazing detail about the process. And I really appreciate that kind of transparency, at least at that level. So how they do this 1-year thing is they used the IPCC's definition of a concept called ton-year accounting. And essentially what this slide is showing, that what it says right there, roughly 30 tons stored for 1 year equals 1 ton stored for 100 years. I didn't go through the process that developed this equation, but the IPCC came up with it. They're using it, and that's how they can compress you into a 1-year contract. Of course, you're not going to get a lot of value because you're only getting paid for 1 year, and it's more tons you gotta put on the table. But it's only for a year, so why not? And then there's the big thing down there. You can also be assured you're not locked in at today's prices for carbon for decades to come. I mean, that's a total deal killer to me for those long-term contracts. So they've gone nationwide. Obviously, they're out here because I was able to put it in. This is when I first started this. I missed the December 8th submit bids, but they immediately emailed me and said, oh, looks like you didn't put in a bid. Our next one will be in the spring. So I didn't lose my position or anything. I just chose not to bid on this most recent cycle, and they were very responsive.
How would you know how even to start your bid? Like, can you say I want $100 per acre?
Yeah. So that gets in a little bit more detail, but you got to know where their general average is and then work off of that. So I would say a high bid for a landowner will be $20 for a credit. And
for credit, not acre.
That's a little, we'll get into that. What's the difference between a credit and an acre?
Mm-hmm.
So let me keep going so we can hold your questions there. And this is an interesting one they had that speaks to a much bigger potential market. They are going to try to move into other ecosystem services while acknowledging that they're fiendishly difficult to quantify compared to carbon, which is really easy or relatively easy. And this also plays into an initiative we've done with the Washington Tree Farm program over the last several months to develop a survey and a methodology for measuring landowners' contributions to ecosystem services, because we want to be able to meet this market when it evolves and have done our homework and our classification and quantification of ecosystem services so that we're ready. These are all not developed markets, but I like that they're looking in that direction, because I think ultimately being able to quantify these in the way that we do as tree farmers, enhancing our landscape, can increase your price or your attractiveness of your bid. Even if they don't have their own dollar value for each little thing you do, if you do a lot of these things well, include that in your bid, that becomes more attractive to a buyer.
I have some more questions here.
Sure.
So this is coming out of the chat from Alan. What happens if the stand burns down?
Right.
Did they have some sort of a risk thing that you have to deal with?
Yeah, all of these address that in the frequently asked questions. If you want me to get that specific answer, I can drill on it after I get through this presentation, but they do address that, and generally you're not liable with some conditions there. It's not as bad as you would think, because they understand that things happen. And I'm not quite sure how they and their buyers offset that with another thing, because you may be in a position as a landowner that you don't have the ability to offset the damage to replace that with other property.
Because you're too small.
You're too small. You took too big of a hit.
Right. Okay. And then there's a nice conversation going off in here in the chat, which is totally relevant to Washington State. And the question is, how do these programs treat forest areas that are reserved from harvest? Think of our riparian buffers. What about if it's in a conservation easement?
Right.
And then the reply was, your timber can't be encumbered. So I guess the question is that considered an encumbrance?
Yes and no. So here's the deal. Conservation easements are generally a no-no, meaning that you're disqualified. However, I submitted a property with a conservation easement. I don't know whether they identified that I had that or not, but according to their terms, my conservation easement was thumbs up, okay, because my easement designates the property as working forest under the conditions of FSC criteria, but it is working forest. So I didn't tell them about the easement, they probably would know that. It's hard to say, but in any case, that type of easement is okay. If you had an easement that did prohibit harvest, you are not eligible. Also, the property I submitted had a sizable enough forested riparian buffer that from their point of view is excluded. And this is kind of the drag that we have in our state. And it would be amazing if we could get some change in that, get DNR to allow us to sell our carbon in those, but most programs are going to not let you list that because it is encumbered, at least from their point of view. So I submitted my property with that. I didn't point out the riparian zone. That's their job to pull it out. And I submitted 40 acres and they came back, you have 38 acres eligible. I mean, it went in their black box and said, oh, 38 acres are eligible. So I think my riparian zone's a little bit bigger than 2 acres. And I don't know if the road, the big gravel road, they pulled that out or whatever. It's hard to say, but the bottom line is if you have a restrictive conservation easement or you have legally set aside buffers, they get taken out of the equation. Those sites do not count towards your credit.
Yeah, but they don't count now, but could we start arguing that they should? I mean, there's some really good conversation going on in this chat that says, you know, our riparian zones are falling apart.
Right.
If we reforested and actually did a better job there, shouldn't we get paid for that in terms of carbon? Because you'll never really got it.
Not only that, but the trees that you do have in there that are good. And that's why if we have an opportunity to develop our own program, we can directly address that bugaboo that these other programs are going to just not give us credit for. So that's something to think about to get, because we really need landowners. The first and best area for carbon sequestration and getting credit for it should be our encumbered zones.
Right, exactly.
This extended rotation I've been talking about is, to me, is the next step. First of all, we should get credit for all the stuff we can't cut. So we got to reverse that dominant thinking out there that, oh, you're restricted, so we're not going to give you credit. Like, okay, that's counterproductive. But so to kind of finish this NCX thing up, I'll go briefly through my personal process with them. This is my parcel. It's an old photo. It's from my conservation easement documents. And this would show up online as a square like this red square. And I just click on it. I didn't even do the boundaries. I just clicked, that's my parcel. And this is 10 years ago. It's greened up quite a bit. But you can see it's about 50% legacy forest. Those are 40 to 80-year-old trees, some older than that, in those residual. And you can see kind of from left to right, the riparian buffer kind of snaking through a little S. So I assume they took that out of it, because if they're even that hip to Washington laws and the riparian buffers. After I did that, answered a few questions, in probably less than a week, I got this response, a little PDF document via an email. It's all electronic. Thank you for your interest, blah, blah, blah. You have 79 credits available, which is interesting because a week before this, actually, I got a letter with like 120 or something. It said, oops, we made a mistake. You're down to 79. And that prompted me to answer, well, you said that I was getting adjusted up, but I got adjusted down. What's that all about? And then I asked some more probing questions. Can I get a breakdown of what these credits consist of? What's the species? What's the volume by species? I would die to know all what you, but I didn't get a response on that. And I said I would go ask them before this, but I haven't gotten around to that yet. But I will find out the details on that. So what I get 79 credits that I could bid out right now. I could have bid out in December and gotten money already. And that's all from just clicking on my property, answering a few questions, and submitting it. So what is, and this is from their information, what is a harvest deferral credit? So I would just go right down to the third line there, board feet, conifer, softwood, Doug fir, 3,500 board feet. Does that sound like a log truck to you?
It's a small log truck. I'm like 5,000 for.
Okay. So there you go. That's how you can, that's one credit. So that's what I can sell. So that's how they convert credits into something that we're more familiar with as board
So
feet.
$20 for half a log truck.
Oh, that's not half a log truck, but
Well,
you have really nice trees. Yeah.
Yeah.
So if you have really nice trees and really big trees, you'll probably get a lot more credits than I did.
Well,
Okay.
yeah, but that's still, I might have to agree with the person who said we should invest. In
Right.
this, but
So
yeah.
just giving you how this is part of their methodology that they're revealing. So I appreciate that, because it helps me to understand what's going on here. Oh my gosh, that's kind of it there.
Yeah.
So I kind of covered all those three things, and
So I think you're right. We need to have our own program.
all right. So I might still bid in this spring just to see how it works.
Yeah, I think it'd be fascinating.
I figured if I got, what I get, 80 credits roughly, And if I bid it at, they said the average could be up to like 14. That's $1,000 for a year for nothing. I mean, that's
Right. I guess, I mean, if you think about it, not as in a replacement of logging, but in addition to, then it makes sense. Right. Because I mean, this is not preventing you from logging. It's just.
No. And
Right.
if you do log, you have to reveal that, and that would affect your ability to do it. They're not expecting you. This program and some of the others expect you to be a producing tree farmer, that you log, but you're selecting either the whole property, that somehow in your process you're going to increase your carbon.
Right.
Okay, you guys, there's a question from David Morgan and then a comment from John Keller. So let's bring them in, because we have I mean, we're over, people can leave. If you don't have anything more to talk about yourself as a presenter, then I think it's time to open up the conversation for folks, and they can stay, I suppose.
Right. Yeah, I'm done.
Says
the end.
Thank you, John.
Thank you, John.
You want me to
David
stop
Morgan.
sharing and let me do that.
Yeah.
Thank you, John.
Okay.
Thanks, John.
But there was a question from David, and then John had made a point. He has some experience here as well. And then Linda was looking for a link. So let's start with David.
Cool. This is fascinating. I also looked at their NCX, and they mapped our property really strangely. So I didn't get an answer back from them about how they dealt with some of the areas that map as open water that aren't and haven't been for 40 years, but Clark County hasn't bothered to update that. And then I think of it too as it's $12. You're being paid for not sending that log truck down the road. It's not replacing that log truck. It's I'm just not going to cut that log truck this year.
Right.
And the other thing that it's an interesting company, because I used their Plot Hound tool for years, which is a iPhone based cruising tool, which is super easy. It's not 100% because you're under the trees and the GPS doesn't work really well, but it's really clean for, like, you know, in, out, volume, stand size, gives you a random distribution of points that you just wander around and be like, okay, here we go. So I think they used a lot of that to build their volume metrics as well. So.
Great. Yeah, I'm good, because if you go to their website, you'll see them promoting Plot Hound.
So John, do you want to talk, John Keller, do you want to just share with the group what you put in the chat and a little bit more information there?
Yeah, just a few brief comments. I had the opportunity to go ahead and bid with NCX on the winter cycle, and ended up signing a contract with them. The bids for a harvest deferral credit actually were all the way down to $7. So pretty minimal, especially for smaller acreages. But I had a pretty good experience with them as far as their responsiveness. You know, we all probably think we have more timber out there on our property than what we do. And I'm one of them. And I thought that the inventory that they used on their base map for determining how many harvest deferral credits I had, I did the transfer into board foot volume, and I thought it was probably maybe half of what I thought I had. And when I approached them, actually I had a number of different really good open conversations with them, and even had some Zoom meetings with their forestry team, because they're trying to get on board and they're looking for tree farms where they can ground truth their data. So they're actually sending out somebody, a third party, to go on out and look at the property and take some plots. I think it's probably just going to be primarily basal area. And they said they're really using it just to try to tweak the tools that they're using. But a lot of the different things that they're using, like FIA data, and they're also using like USGS maps to try to figure out what stream buffers you might have out on your property. So they know they've got a long ways to go. But I found them very, very open, and I'm looking forward to doing business with NCX.
Cool.
Yeah, it's great to hear. You've gone a little farther than I have, and I think they really want to make it work for us.
Agree.
So there was a question here from Norwood, and maybe, you know, John might know this. So it was like he could hypothetically collect $1,000 a year for 40 years since he's not harvesting, and then on the 41st year harvest with no penalty. Would that be true? I mean, would they just do this until that stand? Maybe he's just planted it and he's got a 40-acre clear cut and he planted it. Would that be true, or is there something else? They're paying you based on what you currently have. How does that work? Do you know?
My understanding is that if you did a 1-year contract, the next year you could cut your trees. If you didn't continue your contract, because it's the ton-year concept.
But if you started, so then if you started with regen, they're not going to give you much because of this 3,500.
You won't get any credits if it's regen.
You won't get any credits until
It
you
won't
already
quantify.
have.
Until when, and at what point does it get quantifiable?
That's their black box algorithm. And so I suspect you better average above 40-year-old growth. I mean, I'm just throwing that out there. I have no idea, but there is some, and it's based on, as you saw, their factors, your place, your species, your market availability, the price, and volume, of course. So where does it go above zero? In my case, I have 50% older trees and 50% natural regen. I'm sure that accounted for zero, the natural regen. So they were just using basically 20 acres out of 40 that had any volume on it, but it was significant volume.
Right.
There was somebody else who had their hand up. I don't know where they went.
I had one other quick piece of information to add, if that's okay.
Yeah, please do.
Another really interesting thing about this is, John, you were right in that you have to enroll the whole property, but you can actually withhold harvest deferral credits if you have a planned timber harvesting coming up within the year. So it doesn't mean that you can't harvest any timber at all on your property during that year, but you can only be paid for the harvest deferral credits for those areas that you're not harvesting.
Right. And that's why it's not just your whole property, it's all of your properties, wherever
Yes.
they are. And that's how they prevent the leakage, because if you enroll all of your properties and they can then see the delta, the change from one year to the next, and then if you're required to anticipate or report your harvests and deduct that from your credits, you're good. So you could harvest the whole thing and your credits would go to zero, or harvest enough of it and it would go to zero. So that way you're fully accountable. There's no place you can run and hide unless you lie to them. And you have to sign to that effect. And so it's a contract. You don't want to be caught in a lie like that.
Right. A couple more questions here. Jason Griffith, and then Morris Kirk. You're next after Jason.
So I was just gonna make a comment about what Alan had asked about whether or not you could, I think it was Alan, maybe it was Norwood, who had asked whether or not you could go 40 years in contract and then on year 41 harvest. And back in the early part of the discussion, John had put up a slide that showed basically the amount of carbon sequestration over time for an old growth forest versus like a 40-year harvested forest, and kind of showed that graph, one being much larger area under the curve than the other. And I think that's the whole concept here, right? Is that, yeah, you could certainly do that. You could harvest on year 41 because in the 40 years that you're in contract, your area under the curve is significant, and that's what they're buying.
Right.
So that would be my thought behind it, philosophically at least. But I think I mean, just to put my 2 cents in, I think there are a lot of significant holes in these systems, and a lot of them are trying to come up with means to shore those up. And it does definitely feel like this is something that we should all be looking at very clearly and for a while before any decisions are made, because we'll be able to see how this entire market starts to change over time and how that could benefit us by waiting to choose a system that would benefit us more if we, had more basal growth on the land or whatnot.
Yeah, really good point. Don't sign any long-term contracts.
Yeah,
Let
absolutely.
this thing work itself
that's
out.
like everything I got out of this right now.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I don't see any problem going with a year by year thing. But 10, 20 or longer, I would definitely avoid those kind of commitments while this whole thing shakes out.
Hey, Merck, you're up next. You're still muted if you think you're talking. No. Well, then we'll go to David Morgan.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, we can hear you. You were muted. Go ahead.
Okay, so a couple things. One, John and the others that put this together, thank you very much. It's been really helpful. It's sort of educating me on this, and I have an interest. Also, I'll throw in a plug. I bought and read Ann's book, thoroughly enjoyed it. I'd recommend all small forests and landowners to read it. And I learned a lot. So thank you.
Thank you.
So I have a general question, trying to look at this holistically. I heard more than one person say that we ought to have our own program here in Washington. So Elaine or Kelly or whoever, is there any legislation that's serious about addressing a program, and where is it in the process? Also, how does it fit in with the large amount of DNR land that provide domestic logs for sawmills and public schools are dependent on for funding into this whole sequestering issue?
So, Merck, as I mentioned at the very beginning, that Climate Commitment Act that was passed last spring had in it a provision for us to establish a small forest landowner carbon work group. And it was specifically to kind of work our way through, understanding what's out there. And, we're starting to do that ourselves here. What's out there? And, I get contacted probably 2 or 3 times a month. Somebody wants to promote their program to our community. And I'm like, I don't think we're ready for that. I think we want to be promoted to a group that can sort of aggregate that and look at it critically, which is that carbon work group. Now, unfortunately, they turned it into a statute that we were supposed to do this and report it by next December, but they didn't give us any money to do it. So we're going back to get the funding for that. We do have a plan already submitted to DNR, and it's in the DNR budget, and it's actually in the governor's budget, but it's a long way between here and there to actually get that funded. And then we would ramp up and I think bring all these programs and present them and basically start this conversation on a more detailed, thorough level amongst everybody. What is it that you would need to make this whole? And so you sort of build up your wish list, and then you have to measure your wish list against the reality of who would pay for what. And that would become our program, because obviously these programs aren't going to work. They're not going to work for everyone, but there might be some way to get some variability in there for different purposes. And there might be some way to get some recognition of what we already produce in things like our riparian zones, et cetera. So that's where we are in the program, not very far along, but we're ready when things get put into place.
Thank you.
David, your hand's up. Is that an accident, or do you have some more to say? And you're muted.
No, I had one more question for John, and where you think that tipping point on carbon values is. You know, if it was the pulp market, if it was $30 a ton, I've heard estimates in extreme cases of $200 and $300 a ton as an impact fee in certain scenarios. $300 a ton on big timber for not cutting it down sounds pretty good under those prices. Do you have any thoughts there?
Yeah, so got to be careful what metric we're talking about here. If you're talking the conventional carbon market, dollars per ton, my understanding back when I was looking at it from that perspective is that $50 a ton gets close to market price. That when we put our property up for one of these pilot projects, they were trying to get it for $20 a ton, which I thought was close to what I wanted. And but then it collapsed down to under 10. And so I wasn't interested in that. And so that's if you convert tons to board feet. I think $50 a ton will get you to 300 or so in board feet, $300 for 1,000 board feet or something along those lines. I mean, I don't want to. So you got board feet, you got tons, and then what I've been talking about for this whole presentation is this new credits thing that's not, you can translate between them, but they're not the same thing.
Right. No, that makes sense. I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on where that tipping point line is, because at a certain point on that value chain, the prices of the timber goes up because we're not cutting it because we're storing carbon.
Mm-hmm.
And there's less trees cut, like you were saying earlier, and then that would also push on the carbon prices a little bit. And but then you want to be careful, because you push too far and then you lose your milling infrastructure, and you lose your milling infrastructure, trees are worth basically nothing. Yeah, I mean, those are external things there, but if you're extending rotation, you don't really need to get the full value for your tree year to year. Year to year, what you really need is the loss in the incremental return. So if 5% was your goal, and that's your strike point, 5% return per year, and then it drops below 5% to 4% the next year, so that is that 1% difference that if you got paid that, you'd be whole and you could continue to grow your tree. And every year, the difference between what you should harvest at and what the growth rate is, if you could get that every year, that difference, then you should be whole. But we're down into percentages, very small, 1%, 2%, 3% difference. And that's part, I don't want to get sidetracked with all this kind of number business there, but that's the level we need to get to in developing a carbon program that really works for us, is make sure it ties to what the normal business model would expect. So the delta between the 87 tons in the 80 year and the 57 tons in the 40 year, and you're getting that price there in carbon for not cutting those trees. Well,
you get the price of the loss of your margin because you still have the tree at the end of it. So it's, yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And you should ask your question out loud. Ken Miller.
Ken, yes, I saw it in the chat, but
Yeah,
speak up, please.
I'll read. So he says, can he expect to get $400 to $800 a year for 40 acres of 20-year-old Doug fir?
400 to 800, that's a good number to use.
Okay, so yes, he could. He could expect that if he did the NCX program for 40 acres of 20-year-old Doug fir.
So Orm has this question, can you hold or accrue credits to sell a year or more down the road in the NCX program, or sell them or lose them annually? I think it's not a credit program. They actually just pay you directly, right? It's not like a traditional credit program where you have to hold it for a period of time. Is that true, John?
Yeah, I think it's the only way you use it or lose it is that you just, if you don't sign up for the year, you lose that opportunity. But I assume that after a year, I mean, I don't know if John Keller's still on there, and he may not have gone through a year cycle, but if you come to year 2, they probably, and you re-up, they probably give you a new credits available. And you would think it would go up a little bit every year. So you get to cash in once a year, and the only thing you lose is if you choose not to do it that year. But
Wow.
if your timber is growing, your credit should go up.
Wow. Well, folks, we've done an hour and a half of pretty robust presentation and Q&A, and this is a very, very popular topic. We had a lot of people on. Hopefully the recording will work out perfectly. We'll be able to post so you can go back to that. But I'm going to open up the invitation again to join us when we start this carbon work group. I mean, obviously there'll be a core of people that are sort of doing the organizing, bringing things together, but they're going to need, when people are presenting and when we're discussing, we're going to need not just an audience, but some really thoughtful conversation around what might work for us. So I'm going to invite you again. I think I put that in at least one landowner news a year. And then once we get through this process and we know where we are in terms of the legislature and the funding, I'll certainly send that out to everybody and we can move forward from there. So with that, great big thank you to John and Ann. Great job. And super. Thank you so much. I'm really grateful you guys were joining it, that you could join us today. Take care.